April was the bloodiest month in the Old West. In just 30 days, history recorded botched executions, massacres erased from the books, betrayals between friends, and the murder of America's most feared outlaw. The next 20 facts all happened in April, and they were so disturbing that Hollywood chose to hide them. You won't believe number 20. Fact 1. In the early hours of April 28, 81, more than 100 Apache women and children were killed in their sleep at a camp near Tucson, Arizona. What's most disturbing is that the attack wasn't led by Army soldiers. It was led by local merchants and ranchers from the town itself, who organized a militia of about 150 men. They marched through the night and attacked at daybreak at a place called Camp Grant, where those families were living under supposed military protection. When the news spread, the federal government demanded a trial. In December of that year, more than 100 men went to court. The jury took less than half an hour to acquit every single one of them. No convictions, no punishment. And here's the detail few people know. Some of the leaders of that massacre became respected figures in Tucson, and their names still appear on streets and public buildings in Arizona to this day. Fact 2. Thomas Blackjack. Ketchum was an Old West outlaw who robbed trains in New Mexico. On April 26, 1901, he was sentenced to hang. At the time of the execution, he looked everyone in the eye and said he wanted to have dinner in hell. The problem was that the executioner badly miscalculated the length of the rope for the man's weight. When the trap door opened, the force of the drop was so great that his head was torn from his body in front of everyone. The scene was so brutal that even the spectators panicked. But here's the detail few people know. Photographers captured the whole thing, and the images ended up in the newspapers of the time with no censorship at all. Ketchum went down in history as the only man in New Mexico executed specifically for the crime of train robbery under a law that was practically made just for him. Fact 3. Jesse James didn't die like an outlaw. He died doing housework. In April 1882, America's most wanted outlaw was living under a false name in Missouri. That morning, he stepped onto a chair to straighten a crooked picture on the wall. He was unarmed. Robert Ford, a member of his own gang, took advantage of the moment and shot him in the back. The reason was simple: money. The governor had put a reward on Jesse's head, and Ford wanted to collect it. The part few people talk about is what happened next. Ford was treated like a hero for a while, but public opinion turned against him. People started calling him a coward. A popular song from that time made the title stick forever: The Coward, Robert Ford. 10 years later, Ford was murdered in a bar in Colorado. In the end, the betrayal didn't pay off for anyone. Fact 4. On April 28, 1881, Billy the Kid was locked up on the second floor of the courthouse in Lincoln, New Mexico. Handcuffed, with shackles on his feet, he was waiting to be hanged just a few days later. 2 armed deputies were watching him the whole time. It seemed impossible for him to escape. But what happened that afternoon changed everything. Somehow, in a way no one has ever been able to fully explain, Billy got out of the handcuffs. Within minutes, he killed both guards, grabbed a shotgun from the building's armory, and walked out the front door. Witnesses said he rode down Lincoln's main street on horseback, still wearing the shackles on his feet, waving at the people watching. The detail that still puzzles historians: how exactly did he get the handcuffs off? One theory says his hands were slim enough to slip free. Another suggests someone left a key hidden for him. The truth is, no one knows for sure. Fact 5. In April 1888, a war broke out in New Mexico. Not over land, not over gold, over beef. 2 merchants were fighting over who would supply meat to the U.S. Army. That business dispute turned into gunfights, ambushes, and murder. One side hired young gunmen who became known as the Regulators. On April 1st, those men hid behind a gate on Lincoln's main street and waited for Sheriff William Brady to walk by. When he showed up, they fired at least 12 shots. The sheriff fell dead right there in front of witnesses in broad daylight. One of the shooters was an 18-year-old kid the whole world would later know as Billy the Kid. The detail history books usually leave out is that almost none of the people involved were ever really punished. The Lincoln County War killed dozens of people, and it all started over a beef supply contract. Fact 6. Robert Leroy. Parker was born on April 13th, 8 Gags, in a simple cabin in Beaver, Utah. He was the first child of Mormon immigrants who had come from England looking for a better life. The family was large, 13 children in all, and they followed the teachings of the church to the letter. No one in that community could have imagined what that boy would become, because that boy grew up and took the name Butch Cassidy. He led the Wild Bunch, the gang that pulled off more bank and train robberies than any other group in the Old West, even more than Jesse James. The detail few people know is that his parents spent the rest of their lives in that same part of Utah, attending the same church, and never spoke publicly about what their firstborn son had become. The question that remains is simple. What happens between a childhood in a religious family and a whole life spent running from the law? Fact 7. Butch Cassidy led the most dangerous gang in the Old West and stole more money than just about any other outlaw of his time. But here's the detail that catches everyone off guard. Historians who studied his life in depth never found a single confirmed record of him killing anyone. 0. The guy led the Wild Bunch, a gang that included names like the Sundance Kid, and even so, his style was different. He planned every robbery carefully, walked into banks calmly, sometimes even treated the employees politely, and walked out with the money without firing a single shot. While Hollywood shows him shooting all over the place, the reality was very different. Cassidy openly said he hated violence. It sounds contradictory for a man who lived outside the law for years, but the records point to exactly that. The question is, how did someone like that become the leader of the most feared gang in the American West? Fact 8. Jim Miller went to the Methodist Church every Sunday. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he wore a black suit, and everyone called him Deacon Jim. He looked like the most respectable citizen in town. But behind that image, Miller was one of the most prolific hired killers in the Old West. Historians estimate that he killed somewhere between 20 and 50 people over the course of his career, charging different amounts depending on the target. He operated for decades without ever being convicted, always getting away in court because of lack of evidence or witnesses who disappeared. Then, in April 1909, after being arrested for the murder of a rancher in Ada, Oklahoma, the public lost patience with the justice system. In the early hours of April 19th, about 200 armed men stormed the jail, dragged Miller and 3 other prisoners to an abandoned barn, and hanged all of them from the same beam. None of the lynchers were ever prosecuted. Fact 9. Jim Miller committed his first murder at 8 years old. The victims were his own grandparents, the same people who were taking care of him after his parents died. He waited for both of them to fall asleep and then shot them inside the house. When the police arrived, he pointed the finger at a neighbor, and the most disturbing part, it worked. No one believed a child could be capable of something like that. He was never tried, never punished. That boy grew up and became one of the coldest hired killers the Old West ever knew. They say he killed at least a dozen people over the course of his life, always in a calculated way. always without leaving a trace. His entire career started that night, with two old people asleep and a boy who already knew exactly what he was doing. Fact 10. Wild Bill Hickok was appointed Marshal of Abilene, Kansas on April 15, 1871, in a town so dangerous that nobody wanted the job. Everyone expected him to bring order to that chaos, but what happened was very different. Months later, during a chaotic shootout on a dark night, Wild Bill heard footsteps behind him, spun around, and fired on instinct. The problem was that he hit his own deputy, Mike Williams, who was running in to help him. Williams died on the spot. They say Wild Bill was devastated. The town fired him soon after, and he never again found work as a lawman anywhere. The man considered the greatest gunslinger of the Old West saw his career end because of a single mistake in the dark. Fact 11. On April 29, 1868, the United States government signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota. The agreement guaranteed that the Black Hills would belong to them forever. The promise was clear. As long as the rivers ran and the grass grew, that land would belong to the Lakota. It lasted 7 years. In 1810, an expedition led by Custer found gold in the Black Hills, and everything changed. The government simply ignored the treaty and sent troops to occupy the region. The Lakota did not accept it. What came next went down in history. At the Battle of Little Bighorn in '86, Custer and his men were completely defeated. It was one of the worst military humiliations the U.S. Army had ever suffered. And it all started with a promise broken over gold. Fact 12. Frank Loving and John Allen were longtime partners in Dodge City. They played cards together, drank at the same saloon, and had each other's backs when things got rough. But between them there was a debt of just a few dollars, and no one really remembered who owed whom. That kind of thing eats away at a friendship, little by little. On April 16, 1882, the two ran into each other by chance at the Imperial Saloon in Trinidad, Colorado. The conversation heated up fast. Words turned into threats, and the guns came out of their holsters. Allen was quicker, and Loving fell dead right there in the saloon. The jury acquitted Allen on the grounds of self-defense. But what no one expected was what came next. Allen gave it all up, walked away from the saloons, and became a traveling evangelical preacher. The man who killed his own friend over a few bucks spent the rest of his life quoting the Bible and asking others not to repeat his mistakes. Fact 13. April 1st, 1828. And no, it wasn't anybody's April Fool's joke. Sheriff William Brady was walking down the main street of Lincoln, New Mexico, with 4 men by his side. It looked like an ordinary day, but behind the wall of a corral, Billy the Kid and 5 regulators were waiting in hiding, armed and ready. When Brady reached the right spot, they opened fire. 12 shots. The sheriff dropped dead right there. One of his men didn't survive either, but the part nobody believes is what happened next. Billy the Kid, even after being shot during the gunfight, ran over to Brady's body. It wasn't to check if he was dead. It was to reach into the sheriff's pocket and grab the arrest warrant with his own name on it. The guy had just killed a sheriff, and the first thing he thought about was destroying the evidence against him. Fact 14. Did you know the worst day in U.S. Marshals history happened in April? On April 15, 1892, in Cherokee Territory, in the Going Snake District, a trial that was supposed to be routine turned into a bloodbath. Ezekiel Proctor, a Cherokee man, was on trial for murder in a local court. The problem was that the federal government did not recognize that court's authority and sent a team of federal deputies to arrest Proctor right there on the spot. When the marshals came in armed in the middle of the hearing, chaos broke out. Gunfire was coming from every direction. In a matter of minutes, 11 people were dead, including 8 federal deputies. It was the greatest loss of Marshals in a single event in American history, and the detail nobody expected. The Cherokee jury acquitted Proctor the very next day, as if nothing had happened. Fact 15. Everyone knows about the gunfight at the OK Corral, but almost nobody knows what happened after that. When Morgan Earp was shot in the back and killed while he was playing billiards, Wyatt lost any interest he had left in the law. He got Doc Holliday, Warren Earp, and a few other men together and went hunting down the cowboys through the Arizona desert. There was no trial and no courtroom. It was execution. Frank Stillwell was the first, found riddled with bullets on the tracks at the Tucson train station. Then came Florentino Cruz, Curly Bill Brocious, and others. In a matter of weeks, Wyatt had taken out pretty much everyone involved in his brother's death. But on April 15, 1882, with murder warrants hanging over them, Earp and Holliday crossed the Arizona border into New Mexico and never came back. Wyatt lived into his 80s and died of natural causes in Los Angeles. The law never caught up with him. Fact 16. On April 15, 850, the United States Army attacked an island on Clear Lake in California. Hundreds of Pomo people were there. But here's a detail almost nobody mentions. Most of the tribe's men had gone out hunting. The people left on the island were women, children, and elders. Even so, the soldiers did not back down. In just a few hours, modern estimates point to more than 200 deaths. The place became known as Bloody Island. And do you know what is there today? A hill in the middle of a rural property. No memorial, no plaque explaining what really happened. School textbooks pretty much ignore this episode, but it happened. And April 1850 was marked by the blood spilled in that lake. Fact 17. April 1st, 1840, Bellevue, Iowa Territory. 2 rival political groups were fighting for control of the town, and nobody was willing to back down. The tension had been building for weeks, but that day things finally blew up. More than 40 armed men faced off in broad daylight in the middle of a dirt street. It was not a duel, and it was not an ambush. It was an open battle, like a small civil war, inside a tiny town that barely showed up on the map. At least 7 men were killed right there on the spot. And the ending was just as brutal as the shootout. 3 of the survivors were tried, sentenced to death, and tied to wooden logs. Then they were thrown into the Mississippi River to drown. A medieval death penalty carried out right in the 19th century, all of it because of a local election. Fact 18. On April 15th, 1881, Wild Bill Hickok took over as Marshal of Abilene, Kansas. He was already known as one of the fastest gunmen in the West. But that job in Abilene marked the beginning of the end. 5 years later, in Deadwood, South Dakota, Hickok sat down to play poker in a saloon. For the first time in his life, he had his back to the door. A man named Jack McCall walked in and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok dropped dead, holding the cards, 2 black aces and 2 black 8s. From that day on, that combination became known as the dead man's hand. And here's the detail most people don't know. Even today, professional poker players fold when they get those cards. The superstition was born with a man who was way too fast on the draw to imagine he'd die sitting down. Fact 19. The attempt on the most famous sheriff in Arizona, April of 1982. Virgil Earp was the law in Tombstone. After the gunfight at the OK Corral, the cowboys swore revenge. One night in December 1881, Virgil was walking down Allen Street when shotgun blasts came from the top of an unfinished building. He did not die, but he never fully regained the use of his left arm. And when Morgan, another brother, was murdered months later, Wyatt Earp decided the courts were not going to solve anything. In April 1882, what became known as the Vendetta Ride began. Wyatt put together a group and went after every man connected to the attacks. Curly Bill Brocious took a shotgun blast to the chest. Others disappeared into the desert and were never seen again. No trial, no formal sentence. Justice in that part of Arizona did not go through any courtroom. It went straight through the barrel of a gun. Fact 20. There's a coincidence on the calendar that makes any historian stop and pay attention. April 28th shows up 3 times in the history of the Old West, and none of them are pretty. In 81, on that date, more than 100 Apaches were massacred at Camp Grant before sunrise. In 1888, on that same day, the regulators killed Sheriff Brady right in the middle of the street in broad daylight. And in 81, once again on April 28th, Billy the Kid escaped from jail in handcuffs after killing 2 deputies. 3 brutal events, the same day, different years. Anyone who seriously studies the American frontier knows that April 28th carries more blood than any other date on the calendar. And that says a lot about what spring really meant in the West. It was not a fresh start, it was a settling of scores. All 20 of these facts happened in April, and every one of them is real. Which one did you doubt the most? Write the number in the comments and share this with someone who still believes in Western movies.